Hello and welcome to the Bulwark podcast. I am Amanda Carpenter, sitting in for Charlie Sykes, who is taking a very well-deserved vacation. And while he's out, I have an awesome guest. She is a senior lecturer at Yale's Jackson Institute for Global Affairs. You have seen her on CNN as one of our best legal and national security analysts. She is an editor at Just Security, and she's also been a special agent at the New York office for the FBI. You know who she is Asha Rangappa. Asha, thank you so much for being here.
Thanks, Amanda. I'm excited to be here.
So, do you have a good Labor Day weekend? Are you well rested, ready to go into the second year of COVID?
I am. I'm right now just thankful that my kids are back in school for now, and I'm keeping my fingers crossed that it just stays that way, because you probably, I don't know what your situation was last fall, but mine were remote for pretty much most of the year.
Yeah, that's brutal. I mean, it really just set into me this weekend that we're going into the second year of COVID. I don't know why, it kind of passed me by this summer because it felt like it was going away.
Mm-hmm.
But sending the kids with the mask to school for the second year in a row has really hit me. And maybe I had more time to think about it this weekend because my kids, they've been in school, this might be their third week now. And they came home with a sniffle on Wednesday. And so I thought, oh, okay, no problem. We'll get them a test. We'll see what's going on. We'll do the responsible thing. None of them had fevers. We had a good stockpile of tests because my husband's been traveling, and we just thought it's good to, test every time he kind of comes home from a trip. We had one test left in the cupboard. So we tested the kid who seemed a little more sniffly than the other. It was negative. And then I thought, okay, well, we'll just keep them home because it's gross to be sniffly in a mask, and I don't want them, yuck. I'll go out and we'll keep them home Thursday. I'll get another test for my other kid. I spent all day Thursday running around this area into every Walgreens, CVS, Target, you name it. They were gone. There were no over-the-counter tests anywhere. I mean, I was really baffled. It's like we're going into the second year of this, and I can't find an over-the-counter test. And so I was mad about it. And so then Friday morning, the local pharmacy said, oh, we're getting a shipment on Friday. Check first thing in the morning, we'll have them. Of course they didn't. And they said, we're not getting any. We don't get another truck till next week. So at that point, I'm like, okay, there's frustrating that I've kept my kids now home for 2 days just out of caution. And they were still sniffly. They were still kind of ucky. I said, let's look at the standing testing sites. Okay, great. There's a place in town, a government-run testing site. They're open from 10 to 5. We get there at 3:30. They said, oh, the lady that does testing went home because nobody came today.
Oh, my God.
Sorry. I said, you got to be kidding me. We're in a pandemic. I can't get an over-the-counter test. And at the government-run testing site, the lady went home early because it's Labor Day Friday. Great. So then I get online. The first pharmacy test I can get in the area is for Sunday morning. Okay, lock that in. Whatever. Go back to the government-run testing site on Saturday. Get it done. So now my daughter has 2 tests, which is more than we need. But at this point, I need a test result Monday. Right? So right. I can send the kid to school on Tuesday. We go all day Monday. No result. So I, email the school. This is what we're doing. Finally, the Walgreens test came in overnight. She's negative. Still haven't got the government testing result. And I'm just scratching my head because testing was always supposed to be part of the protocol. We had testing. It was available. It is part of the regime to keeping things open, in addition to masking, in addition to vaccines. And it just seems like we completely gave up on it. Have you seen anything like this?
No, Amanda, you're totally right. And I think the idea of that we've given up is what it feels like to me. I don't know if you remember the Seinfeld episode where George basically says, when you give up, you put on sweatpants. And I feel like collectively as a nation, we've just basically, we're all wearing sweatpants right now.
I'm in Lycra as we speak. It's not sweatpants, but it's pretty much the athleisure equivalent.
Right, exactly. Like elastic waistband. We don't care what we look like because, yeah, it feels like a year and a half into this. This should be a very streamlined operation, a well-oiled machine, figuring out like other countries have done this.
Yes.
Like it doesn't feel like this should be, reinventing the wheel. And the other thing, Amanda, and I think this might be part of it, is like going back into this, you mentioned the second year, last year it felt like we have, we're all in this together. Like we have to do this, we have to wait for the vaccine. This year, I think there's also like a lot of anger underlying it because we are doing this again. It is Groundhog Day because most people are not like you, Amanda. They aren't being cautious. They aren't testing. They aren't wearing masks. And that is increasing the burden on you and me. Do you see what I'm saying? Like the ones.
Oh, 100%.
Like
I'm compassion fatigued out, and I can't even imagine what it is like for the doctors and nurses who are dealing with this for the second year post-vaccine.
No, it's like Grasshopper and the Ant, and we're the ants.
Oh,
and I've been working for like a year and a half, and the Grasshopper's just like walking around spreading COVID.
Yeah. Well, the good news is that Joe Biden is going to give a speech this week about back to school. My kids have been back to school for 3 weeks, and I'm not really knocking Joe Biden, but the idea that he's going to give a speech this week and talk about getting back to school and getting through the pandemic when I think a lot of parents have been already fighting through this since August is a little off the mark.
Yeah, I was about to say, like, my sister lives in Texas and her kids started school in like the second or third week of August.
Yeah, and I'm afraid we're going to see, listen, I am here as a pundit and an analyst, for the finger pointing and how red states and blue states handled this differently. But if Joe Biden gets up there and acts like Ron DeSantis is the reason all this is happening, I just don't think that is going to pass muster, especially when we're failing on things like the testing, things that are so basic that we had control over. I mean, we as a nation have vaccines and we have testing. We know what works. And so I'm really just hoping he points to models that work for the country rather than giving more attention to the people who are bringing us down.
What do you think about like pulling the hard levers at this point?
Oh, the mandates?
Like, requiring vaccines to fly.
Oh, I could go more. I mean, I am up for upping insurance premiums for people who refuse the vaccine. Name the stick. I'm probably for it at this point. Do you have some?
Only to beat people with who haven't gotten vaccinated. No, but yeah, I think that's right. The incentives have been put out there. The carrots have been put out there. You get $100, you get $1,000, you get,
a gun raffle. We have those here in West Virginia. You can win a new truck, a gun license, a fishing license, and $1 million potentially.
Yeah. And it's like, I do feel like from what I've seen, they've made it as easy as possible to get the vaccine, unless I'm missing something. I mean, I remember going to New Orleans this summer, right there in the airport. Like you get off and it's like free COVID vaccine, like right here.
I believe they were doing shots for shots at some place. If you got the COVID vaccine, you would get a shot of your choice.
Yeah,
which I'm for that. Whatever.
So that's not working. And yeah, look, we do this for so many other things, right? I mean, we nudge behavior in particular ways that we deem socially desirable. We use the tax code. As you noted, we use insurance premiums. We use fines. I mean, for everything from like texting while driving to, getting energy efficient, appliances and windows for your home, getting married, like all of these behaviors we try to, or, buying a home, like we try to encourage people to go in certain directions. So I don't see how the vaccine, especially when the net effect on society is so much greater than many of those other behaviors that the government nudges in one direction or another, for a vaccine, the net benefit is so much greater that I think they would be justified in doing that.
Well, it seems to me that we have a uniquely American system where we maximize the worst outcomes of all kinds. We've spent all the money on the COVID relief. We've got the vaccine, we've got the testing, and somehow we still have more deaths post-vaccine in some areas, which is just it really I don't know how you do that, but somehow states are accomplishing that. But let's turn to, I don't know, this is one of my favorite subjects, and I suspect maybe one of yours. Not totally sure, but that would be Kevin McCarthy. Quasi Quevin, is that how you'd say that? There was some stuff he was doing over the weekend, and it seemed to me that he thought he could sneak this little TV interview with a California TV station where he would say that Donald Trump was cleared of any role in the January 6th riot. He went on television and he said, the FBI has investigated this. The Senate had bipartisan committees come back. And you know what they found? That there's no involvement. And then he went on to blame this on Nancy Pelosi. Now that seems like a change from what he said, of course, about a week after the insurrection. But have you seen any report like that by any chance?
I haven't seen that specific one, Amanda. I suspect that, I believe that it's out there and is probably ricocheting in particular information silos for people who are, receptive to hearing that and, need that confirmed. But it's the same playbook, Amanda. It's discrediting any investigation as being, a witch hunt. And we've gone through this before. We went through this with the Russia investigation. I suspect, it's just going to happen all over again with the January 6th investigations, whether they are the criminal investigations or the congressional investigations. But look, it's a playbook that works. So I'm not surprised that this is what he's doing. By the way, I think that Kevin, every time his name is mentioned, should be said in the same tone as Newman from Seinfeld.
You're a big Seinfeld fan, huh?
I am. I mentioned it twice now, haven't I? Yeah. I don't know why.
No, I enjoy the references. I've seen enough of it to know what you're talking about, but that's pretty good. So it'd be like Newman, Kevin, is that it? Because I keep thinking of Kevin from Home Alone. Because I want to scream it, Kevin! But here, okay, so it sounds like the January 6th committee, they're not going to let him slide on this kind of stuff because they issued a statement over the weekend that was pretty tough. And they had just elevated Liz Cheney to the number 2 position, which I personally think is wonderful. But they just came out and said that McCarthy is engaging in a, quote, misinformation campaign. Mm-hmm. They said the report was baseless. They went around and looked at it. And they also pointed to the fact that this is completely inconsistent with what he said on January 13th, when he said specifically that Donald Trump bears responsibility for the attack on Congress by mob rioters. And so this just kind of got my gears turning, because we can talk about why Kevin changed his mind. And I think you and I would probably both agree that it's politics. But isn't this something that the January 6th committee should actually look at? Like, when Kevin McCarthy, as the leader of Republicans in the House, changed his message, because they could talk to a lot of his colleagues to try to figure out when and why, because this is a person who had special information into the president's state of mind that day when they were begging him to call off the rioters. And McCarthy, when he was acting, it seems, on his own volition, said Trump was responsible. He bared responsibility. But now he's completely changing his story and straight up lying about the government clearing him of any responsibility. That, to me, is very interesting and something worth dwelling on.
Yeah, and I think you've hit the nail right on the head, Amanda. He is a fact witness. He spoke with Trump that day. From reports, which I'm not sure whether they came directly from him. I mean, he was on the phone telling Trump to get his people to stop and leave. Mm-hmm. So I think what's happening here is more than politics. Kevin McCarthy is terrified because when the investigation comes to him, whether it's the FBI, whether it's members of Congress, he is in a major dilemma. If he lies to either of these, to the agency, to this body, that's a crime. And if he tells the truth, then he is going to essentially, be contradicting the narrative that Trump wants him to espouse publicly. So, I think what I see a lot in this, in kind of the statements recently about threatening the telecom companies if they comply, these are the actions of someone who is scared and desperate, because
Well,
he's kind of cornered in now, into having to really explain what happened that day, at least from his point of, from his vantage point.
Yeah, cornered in is a really good way of putting it, because, I mean, isn't the truth of the matter that, Kevin McCarthy may not have been in on the violence,
Mm-hmm.
but politically speaking, he was in on the misinformation, disinformation campaign that led to the violence every step of the way. I mean, he was the guy after the election who went on Fox and said, Trump won the election. Don't be quiet. We can't let this happen before our eyes. He was in on refusing to call Biden president-elect. He supported that stupid lawsuit by Texas Attorney General Ken Paxton to try to cancel the the votes in the swing states Biden won. And he was still supporting objections after the attack when it came to Pennsylvania and Arizona.
Mm-hmm.
And so he was in on it. Everything the January 6th committee is investigating about what led to that attack, Kevin McCarthy played a role in. And so it is really confounding to me that he can do all that in the open, try to take a pass on the violence, and say, well, Donald Trump didn't have anything to do with it. Because I think he's trying to say, oh, I didn't have anything to do with it either, which just isn't the case.
Yeah. I mean, when we think about January 6th, I think we need to think of a spectrum of complicity. And there are many, many people who were complicit in what took place that day, and who continue to be complicit today. And I think that you're right. Like, there are some people who I believe are very directly complicit, in terms of potentially, conspiracy, as in knowledge, agreement, perhaps even facilitating or assisting people who participated in the attack itself. But there is a way to be complicit, even if you didn't necessarily know that exact thing was going to take place, if you are responsible in helping to amplify and repeat the lie that motivated the people to get there. I mean, we have to remember that the big lie is basically, at this point, and it was at that point emerging, but it is now at this point a domestic terror ideology. That's my point of view. I mean, it's no different than, Al Qaeda or ISIS wanting to establish, the worldwide Islamic caliphate, or like, they have an idea of restoring Trump to office. That's what's motivating this, right? Like, he really won, but there is an end goal here, which is essentially to overthrow the government and reinstall Trump, which I guess was supposed to happen in August, and it didn't. And I'm not really sure if they moved the goalpost. So if you're helping to, prop up any part of the big lie, you are complicit. Not only in what happened on January 6th, but also in potential violence that may happen in the future as well. Yeah,
that's a really good point. I mean, the way you put it, it's a domestic terror ideology. It's provocative, but I think it's right. It's hard for me to hear the comparisons of, these violent Trump supporters to the Taliban. I'll just be honest with you on that. I hear where you're coming from, but we've seen domestic terrorism as a result of this. That's a really hard truth.
Yeah. And I mean, the comparison is in the structure of the narrative, right? This they believe that they are engaging in a righteous cause that is, and when, especially when officials like Kevin McCarthy promote it, they believe that they are engaging in patriotic actions, and that this is, this is the path to reestablishing kind of a righteous government.
Yeah, that's kind of, just this morning I watched a video of one of the Proud Boys that got sentenced to some kind of jail sentence. And of course, they were filming themselves walking up to the entryway, dutifully turning themselves in. They obviously viewed this as some kind of PR stunt. They're not ashamed of what they did. They're not ashamed of the role that they played in January 6th. If anything, they're proud of it and are using it to recruit more members.
Oh, totally. Yes. And I mean, there's just a lot of different parallels. And I mean, you can see it in the way that, Homeland Security, I mean, the national strategy for countering domestic terrorism is very similar to how we have approached international terrorism. It's disrupting plots in action. It is information sharing about what these people are, planning and plotting and saying, and also disrupting recruitment, which is a huge concern right now because, using these events, these, the people on TV who are talking about this and January 6th itself as a way to motivate people and encourage people to essentially join the movement or whatever you want to call it at this point, is a huge concern.
Well, let's dig in a little bit more as to the story of this and what the January 6th committee is attempting to do. You mentioned the phone records that Kevin McCarthy is very upset the January 6th committee is seeking. And, we all saw last week when he threatened them, saying if these companies comply with the, quote, Democrat order to turn over private information, they are in violation of federal law and subject to losing their ability to operate in the United States. And that was followed up over the weekend with another letter from 11 House Republicans stating that they do not consent to the release of confidential call records or data as a part of this investigation. And those signers are probably the people you would expect. They are people that were closely affiliated with that riot rally that happened before the attack. Their names are Andy Biggs, Jim Banks, Matt Gaetz, Jody Heiss, Scott Perry, Lauren Boebert, Louis Gohmert, Paul Gosar, Marjorie Taylor Greene, Madison Cawthorn, and Mo Brooks. And so can they refuse to consent to their phone records being handed over, Asha?
Okay, well, Amanda, I think we can safely say that group of people does not belong to Mensa. Okay. So, I don't know that they fully understand what the law is, but no, they can't, a subpoena, a lawful subpoena is not contingent on getting the consent of the individual whose records are being requested. The standard is whether the subpoena is relevant to a lawful investigation. And Congress has very lawfully constituted this body, this committee, to conduct oversight. Congress has broad oversight authority. And, if these requests are relevant to what they are seeking to investigate, then I don't see any legal bar to them being turned over.
And to be clear, it's not their records. They belong to the phone companies, correct? And phone companies comply with these requests all the time.
That's right. These are third-party records, and this whole area gets very nuanced. But in general, you don't have a reasonable expectation of privacy in information that essentially you have consented to for a third party to have. Right.
So it does seem unusual that we're in a situation where there are members of Congress potentially subpoenaing information from fellow members of Congress. This could get pretty nasty down the road.
Yeah. And I think that, I would say that has more to do with the state of our, of being in the communications age. But if you look back on other investigations, Watergate,
Mhm.
Iran-Contra, the communications that took place between the people who were involved. And of course, you're right that those didn't necessarily involve other members of Congress, but they involved government officials, were what was at stake, right? Because those communications will tell you a lot about exactly, what the network was and who was in touch with who. The truth is that now people, there's probably a lot of, phone activity that day. And so
Mhm.
that those records will tell us, or will tell the committee, a lot about who was in touch with who, how frequently. And then, that will also pave the way for then, I think here's the next step is whether those members of Congress are going to be subpoenaed themselves to
Yeah.
testify about, so at 4 p.m. on January 6th, you made a phone call to blank. What was the substance of that conversation? And I think, again, that is what they are most afraid of.
Yeah, and I don't think these threats are reason for the committee not to do it or be, hesitant in going after these facts. But you do have to wonder, given the fact that we know McCarthy desperately wants to be leader again, what these Republicans, as ham-fisted and clownish as they may appear to be, might do if they are in charge of these committees and decide to launch their own investigations about whatever. I mean,
Mhm.
Benghazi was a fairly serious affair, in my opinion. I know it got extremely political. There was substance behind it, but this would just be, I can't even imagine what could come next if they try their hand at this. But if you don't mind, I really would like to dig into these January 6th requests a little
Mhm.
bit more with you. Attention, this is going to get nerdy, guys. Sorry, but I'm fascinated by what this committee is attempting to do, because I do view this as a very serious effort. And it really seems to me like they know what they're doing. They're extremely focused in going after a certain series of facts. And so there was this, and this all kind of happened over August. I don't think when a lot of people were paying attention, which is probably for the better, to be quite honest. Um, but this first request was made on August 25th. And, the way it was kind of reported in the news is just like, oh, they need records from national archives and federal agencies. But when you look at the agencies they're targeting and you look specifically at the information they say they want, it paints a picture that is worth discussing. And so, first, I want to talk to you about the records you're looking at, specifically from the executive branch and Department of Justice. Now, I'm just going to read what the committee put out. When it comes to executive branch, they're looking for records pertaining to strategies and plans to derail the electoral college vote count, planning for and coordination of the rallies leading up to January 6th, the former president's knowledge of the election results and what he communicated to the American people about the election, and potential plans to disrupt the peaceful transfer of power and challenge the validity of the 2020 election. Asha, what does that say to you about what they're looking for and potentially, what laws could have been violated?
Yeah, so that tells me that they are looking to answer the question of, did President Trump understand that he was losing or had lost the election legitimately and was engaging in a deliberate and concerted effort with top officials in the Department of Justice to cast doubt on those results, and potentially, engage in fraudulent investigations based on,
Right. And we know Donald Trump doesn't use email, but a lot of other people do. And I
right.
imagine there are other people in the executive branch observing things who weren't completely on board, but have knowledge. And once these facts start to dribble out, may be talking to the committee or may have already talked to the committee and
Yeah.
told them what records to go after specifically. Is that a possibility?
Yes. And so, and here's where I would just flag one, possible like obstacle that I hope the committee takes into account. I mentioned Iran Contra before. And I also mentioned how they might subpoena some of these people to come testify. And some of the information that these people may be asked to testify about could implicate them in criminal activity. So, for example, one possibility, if, members of the Trump administration and senior officials in the Department of Justice were trying to, cast doubt knowingly cast doubt on otherwise legitimate election results or create fraudulent investigations, that could be a conspiracy to defraud the government of the United States, for example. Now those people could, in front of the committee, say, I plead the fifth. I'm not going to answer that question. And they have the right to do that. Now, the committee could at that point immunize them. And say, you can testify and what your statements won't be used against you. Now, this happened in Iran-Contra. And what happened was, as a result of immunizing the witnesses' testimony in front of Congress, it ended up compromising the criminal investigations that were being conducted by the independent counsel. Because when they got into court, the independent counsel couldn't prove, even if they took out these statements that were given to Congress, that the case that was built against them was completely independent of that. And so
doesn't that provide an incentive, I guess, for the committee to try to immunize people to get the information out? That's a really complex question.
Well, what I'm saying is that then that could, it could end up making it harder to prosecute these people for if they did, in fact, violate the law.
Well, let me ask you this. If say, the committee does turn up evidence that does lead someone to suspect there was criminal activity, could they just turn that over to the Justice Department to pursue rather than use it as a part of their investigation, which really is only a narrative building exercise?
Absolutely. So, if they uncover evidence that, may have been a crime, they can certainly refer that to the Department of Justice and allow the criminal process to take its route. And in that case, they may want to wait until that criminal process, the criminal investigation has kind of run its course before, having these people testify. But for the American public and for this committee, that's a dilemma, right? Because that means that, because part of the purpose of this is not only to get to the bottom of what happened, but also to have a public accounting of it. So, it's in the interest of these committees to have these people testify because it's about accountability to the American people. And that is sometimes at odds with a criminal investigation, which is kind of under wraps until they finally get everything squared away.
Well, does this have any similarity? I mean, I'm just speculating here to sort of the classic mob investigation where you try to get the lower level fish, or in this case, lower level government officials, to tell everything, give them immunity, and then climb up the ladder.
Yeah, I mean, you could do that. But I think that these Department of Justice officials, members of Congress, I mean, they're towards the top of the totem pole.
Yeah.
In my opinion.
Yeah, I guess I just have in my mind that there may be, some communications officials in the White House who saw a lot of everything and can point to the right things and what, potentially people of interest.
Yeah.
But let's go on to, since we're talking about the Department of Justice, because the J6 committee is also making specific requests to DOJ. And I'll read that section here. For that agency, they're looking at records pertaining to the potential invocation of the Insurrection Act, martial law, or the 25th Amendment, communications between the department and the former president's campaign legal team and others dealing with the validity of the 2020 election or challenges to the election outcome, the vice president's role as a presiding officer in the certification of votes of the Electoral College, in coordination and communications with other government entities during the January 6th attack. A couple of things stand out to me there, but what stands out to you?
Basically, all of these relate to the peaceful transfer of power and what they were expecting and what they were trying to plan for. I mean, essentially, Amanda, to be quite frank, this sounds like they are investigating whether there was an attempt to plot a coup. Or I guess technically it would be an auto coup, which is like you're already in power and you try to stay in power. But, Insurrection Act, the vice president, like, is he, I think, I would guess the question is, was there research being done on is there any way that he could invalidate the Electoral College results, because that was what was being put out publicly. This is, it's interesting because normally these kinds of communications would be covered by, different kinds of executive privilege, like deliberative process, which, the executive branch has invoked in other contexts. And it's really interesting that the Department of Justice, in response to these requests, has let witnesses know, and I suspect it's going to apply to these documents, that they are not going to be invoking executive privilege on all of these requests. And they've done it for two reasons. They've justified it. Now, one thing that's really interesting is the executive privilege is held by the current president because it adheres to the office, not the person. And presidents of either party have an interest in invoking it and keeping the scope of that privilege as broad as possible because, again, it affects what they do as well, right? You don't want Congress or judicial branch always like poking into your business. So what the Department of Justice has said is we're going to not invoke it here for two reasons. And this is what makes it different than any other thing. Number one, this is an extraordinary circumstance that requires us to accommodate Congress in its request. And, I think there's like a comparison to after 9/11, they handed over the president's daily brief, which they otherwise may not have had to do, to help the 9/11 Commission in understanding what intelligence was available to the president when that happened. And the second thing, and this is really important, it gets to these specific requests that you're pointing to. They said, we also believe that the requests, the information being sought relates to how Trump was behaving in his personal capacity as a candidate for re-election, not as the president of the United States. And so all of these requests, the Insurrection Act, all this stuff is really about him as a candidate potentially trying to win. Does that make sense? And
that's really interesting because, this was all geared around, potentially decertifying the results and maintaining his political power. So what you're saying is these just weren't official acts he was taking. The records requests are aimed at campaign communication to maintain power.
Essentially. Or at least that's how Department of Justice is distinguishing this. So that kind of to your point, like let's say later Republican committee comes back and is like, well, we're going to request all of this stuff. And, you didn't invoke executive privilege. There's a way for them to say, this is why this particular thing is different. Yeah. And kind of different than any other thing, any other Congress, executive branch, whatever, tug of war.
Yeah, I in particular, I'm fascinated by the negotiations over the Insurrection Act and the potential of that being invoked so that martial law could be declared, because that is what a lot of these militia groups were talking about, planning for, if you read the court documents and other things from other investigations that have been discovered. But this other thing, I feel like we should flag, there are two departments looking at Pence's role as presiding officer. There's that line I mentioned from the DOJ, where they want to look at his role as presiding officer. But then there's a specific request to the Department of Homeland Security, where they're asking about records related to the Secret Service protection of Mike Pence and his family on January 6th. And that just strikes me as something that's very specific. And there was some reporting that Pence at one point was afraid to get in the car with the Secret Service at some point. And so it seems to me there's something the committee suspects that they're going after related to Mike Pence. There's a lot of misinformation that was rattling around when it came to his ability potentially to overturn the election. But yeah, that's just something I'm sort of keeping an eye on. And this leads into the second information request, which is from social media companies. And this is more straightforward. But they sent out these letters on the 27th looking at records related to the spread of misinformation, efforts to overturn the election, domestic violent terrorism, and foreign influence. And what they're getting at here is they want to look at what social media companies did or didn't do to stop the flow of this information. And, this to me has been such a blind spot for Congress. Nobody knows what to do about it. But this is a really interesting vector to explore this problem in the way that they're, at least now, at least initially, asking the social media companies, hey, all this stuff happened. It was organized in your platform. Give us 2 weeks to tell us what you did about it.
Yeah, I mean, it goes back to what I mentioned before, that we are in an information age, which makes the landscape very different than essentially any other, scandal or congressional investigation. I mean, let's imagine that after Nixon, gets busted for Watergate, he wanted to, instigate like a national revolt. It would have been really hard. Back then, there were 3 channels on television. He has no way of getting, a particular kind of message out, even as president, to just masses of people, or kind of allowing things to circulate from the grassroots level up. Social media makes this possible, right? You can use proxies. Foreign countries can capitalize on misinformation and help amplify them. Things can reach billions of people in a matter of hours. And so, something like January 6th, and I think this, the intelligence community and FBI in particular has been, I think, rightly criticized for kind of not being on top of this. All of these were circulating. Come to January 6th, Patriot, 1776, all this nonsense was circulating on social media through December, leading up to the events of January 6th. And some of those themes were being echoed by members of Congress and by the president. So, yes, it's completely connected. And I think you're exactly right that in general, Congress has no idea how to handle the role of social media in today's threat environment.
Now, let me ask you, do you think, this committee is going to make a report and, they have a long time to do it. It's not going to happen anytime soon. I assume they'll have some recommendations that they also include in it. Would it be weird if they included social media reform ideas in those recommendations? Do you think that would be an appropriate place to put something like that?
Not at all. I mean, the Senate Intelligence Committee's investigation into Russian election interference addressed this. So absolutely, they should address it in, this context. I mean, I think the challenge is when you're dealing, what we have is a confluence, Amanda, of a bunch of different things. You not only have free speech, you have political speech, you have domestic actors who have First Amendment rights. And then, you have the social media companies sitting right on top of this. And so it becomes a much harder landscape to navigate than, say, dealing with, foreign terrorist groups, right? Who have no First Amendment rights. We have a national security, reasons to say, like, censor that information or get social media companies to do that. Hopefully this committee will also hear from thoughtful experts and scholars on exactly how to navigate this thicket if they do decide to put recommendations in, because I don't think they are. I think they should, but I don't think they are simple. They need to be thoughtful and nuanced in how to address the role of social media in domestic terrorism, extremist violence contexts.
Yeah, I think that's right. Okay. Yeah. And just to, close the loop, we already talked about that third records request. That was for the phone records. But it's really interesting, again, the targeted way they're going after this. They're going after records of individuals who could serve as links between those who are involved with the organization and planning of the rallies and those that committed violence. And I saw reporting that, in this first tranche, Kevin McCarthy's records aren't even included in it. And that just, that seems smart. They're looking at the people who were the links.
Mm-hmm.
And I think, as you mentioned before, this isn't just the date and timestamp of a phone call. There is a lot of information that can come out of those records in regards to logistics, who was where at what point in time,
Mm-hmm.
how they moved in response to what kind of messages. And so, for the right kind of analysts, and I believe this committee has them, there are really interesting pictures that are going to be painted of how this movement evolved over time and even on the ground that day.
And Amanda, go ahead. Sorry.
No, you go.
Oh, I was just going to say, don't forget, as we've already talked about, these are parallel investigations. You're only talking about the congressional requests. There's a criminal investigation underway. I'm 99% sure that the FBI already has this information.
That's interesting. Maybe that's why they don't need a subpoena. They can just ask for DOJ to send it over. Do they share information like that ever? Is that allowed?
That's a good question. I don't know how porous that particular...
It seems like that would be strange, but I don't know.
Yeah, just because they're different purposes, and I would think that to preserve the integrity of each of their investigations, they would want to go through their own process rather than...
but what you're saying is the phone companies already have them on a shelf ready to go, maybe.
I have no doubt that that's the case. I mean, these would have been relevant to the FBI's investigation, and not just because, these particular people are necessarily because they're under investigation, but again, they need to get the full picture of what was happening, as you just noted, logistically on that day, right? So again, the standard of it being relevant to an ongoing investigation to me would be met, whether or not the subscribers of those records themselves are necessarily criminally liable.
Well, while I have you here, I want to ask you about another really tough topic, and I think this is good for us to address because it's relatively unusual for two women to be discussing this topic on the air, and that's the Texas abortion law. And what I'm really interested in hearing you explain is, in particular, this new private right of action. Because, I've been in the conservative movement. I've followed all this stuff for a long time. And these conservative legal scholars seem pretty proud of themselves for creating this new way of challenging abortion laws in a way where they don't have to, go against Roe versus Wade by forcing the government to interfere with abortions. But now they've allowed private citizens to go after other private citizens on suspicion, I guess, that someone is obtaining an abortion or assisted in that. Can you explain how new this is, how unusual it is? And then I want to get into the potential unintended consequences and potential for harassment.
Yeah. This is very unusual. So normally when states have passed bans, enforcement bans on abortion, enforcement of that ban is put in the hands of state officials, which then allows people who want to challenge it, bring an injunctive relief suit against those state officials, and then that can be litigated. And maybe in the meantime, there's a stay on the law going into effect. And basically, what this particular law has done is circumvent that state action piece by essentially saying, hey, there's a ban, but guess what? The state officials aren't going to be the ones enforcing it. What we're going to do is allow private individuals, and basically any private individual, to bring a civil lawsuit against anyone they think is violating this ban, including and up to aiding and abetting in violating this ban, or even intending to do so, which is very broad.
Yeah, and I think this is worth stopping on because I really haven't seen this aspect of it addressed. In the fact that someone can sue someone based on the suspicion that you had an abortion. I mean, what if, let's say, a lot of women between 6 and 12 weeks have miscarriages. People that wanted to have those babies. It is terrible. It is tragic. It is traumatizing. And you're telling me that potentially some jackwad sitting in a basement somewhere can suspect that some woman had an abortion and take her to court and make her prove what happened to her and her body and her potential baby?
So it's important to note that this bill doesn't actually target the women themselves. It's targeting providers or anyone who assists or aids and abets in helping her to procure the abortion.
But they're
So,
asking for her records.
yeah, I mean, and that would, if so, a civil lawsuit, let's remember, is very different than a, say, criminal investigation. Anyone can file it. And yes, there are things in the process, like a motion to dismiss, a motion for summary judgment, which can get a frivolous lawsuit thrown out at a very early stage. To get the records, you'd have to pass those particular, points and then get to the point of discovery. And I think in a lot of these cases, they wouldn't. But, this kind of starts to get into the unintended consequences. But the point is, people can file frivolous lawsuits.
Yeah.
And if they have
against medical providers who, I mean, as if being a gynecologist and dealing with babies wasn't hard enough. I mean, you're talking about the people that have to deliver really bad news to people on the regular. I'm in my mid 30s. I know a lot of women who desperately want their children, and for a lot of reasons, it doesn't happen for them.
Mm-hmm.
I know a lot of women who had to get quote unquote an abortion that never wanted it. Mm-hmm. It was the last thing they ever wanted to do.
Mm-hmm.
And so now these doctors are going to have to prove. I mean, they may be 100% pro-life. I don't think there's any woman that walks into a place wanting an abortion.
No.
I don't think this is the kind of procedure that, you go and get your nails done and you go out and celebrate after, contrary to what, I think a minority of liberal opinion is out there. And I don't understand how this all comes down on the doctors and the women, and there's no consequences for men. There's never any consequences for men from the pro-life movement.
No, they could have sex with anyone they want and impregnate them, and then they just, skip off into the sunset. But so, I think the problem with this law, Amanda, regardless of where you fall on the policy issue of abortion itself, is that it's an extremely cynical approach to achieving a policy outcome. And I think it gets to this bigger idea where we are at a point where the ends justify the means, even if it means burning everything down in the process, including our, institutions, our processes, our systems. And what's happening here is this is opening the floodgates to just a slew of lawsuits, meritorious or baseless, against anyone, and using essentially the fear and threat and monetary ruin that would result from this litigation to essentially scare doctors and providers, drive them out of business, or drive them out of the state. I can't imagine that there is a judge in Texas who wants to see this law pass. I mean, it is going to just ruin, like we're seeing in COVID right now, where, these COVID patients are making it so that truly sick or, other sick patients can't get ICU beds. That's what's going to happen to the docket in Texas, where you're going to have, freaking crazy lawsuits and people who really, have legitimate disputes to resolve in the judicial process are going to end up getting delayed and not getting justice. Doctors are going to see their insurance, liability insurance premiums skyrocket to the point where I don't know if they will want to remain in Texas to practice. And so, it's a very cynical way to ultimately avoid what I think should be the hallmark of a democracy. If you really believe in this policy solution, the state should implement it, allow and take accountability for it and say, yes, this is the policy that we have implemented. We are going to enforce it, and then allow it to be litigated. And if it goes up to the Supreme Court and they want to overturn Roe versus Wade, I mean, that's a separate issue. But at least it is holding, like, the state is saying we are willing to go to bat. And what they're doing here is kind of a too clever by half strategy that if this kind of strategy is approved, if like any Tom, Dick, and Harry can sue, anybody that they, a doctor they just don't like and accuse them of like performing abortions. I mean, we can apply this to a lot of different contexts, Amanda. We're just going to become a crazy wild west of litigation for every policy issue you can think of.
Yeah. Well, I am ready. I am ready to lead a new pro-life legal movement where we actually crack down on the Tom, Dick, and Harrys. Because the truth of the matter is that a woman can only get pregnant a few times a month. Men can impregnate a woman pretty much any time they want. If you want to talk about unwanted pregnancies, you can look at the men. And if you want to say that there are consequences for men and point me to child support laws, that is a joke. Most of the time, I think it's like 61% of men pay child support. And that's a joke. That's a joke because women give up their lives, and that's great. They may want to do that for their children. But the fact when it comes to mothers and babies, that men continually get off scot-free when they are the ones that actually cause the unwanted pregnancies. You can say it takes two to tango. It does take two. But just mathematically speaking, the burden falls on the men. And we have the science. We can prove paternity. And so let's do that. Let's start enforcing the law against men who cause these unwanted pregnancies and too often walk away from the kids with no penalty at all. I'm ready to change the paradigm on that one.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, there are a lot of, you're just basically pointing to structural and systemic issues that beyond just, the burden on the woman of carrying the pregnancy, as you just said, lay everything at her feet, which is problematic and which...
Condoms are cheap. Birth control is expensive, hard to obtain, has a lot of side effects, takes a while to kick in.
Vasectomies are reversible.
Yes. We can go up and down the side of the ledger. But anyway, thank you for letting me get that off my chest because in all the time that I've been in commentary and politics, I've never got to have that part of the discussion. So I appreciate that. But before you go, you have had an amazing career. I mean, I think anybody that talks about you says, oh my gosh, she is such a badass. She's done so many amazing things. And I was doing my Wikipedia stalking of you and noticed that you started training at Quantico for the FBI in 2001. So that means 9/11 has pretty much been hanging over your entire career in law and security. And I am just curious about your reflections coming up on that 20th anniversary.
Yeah. I mean, it's really interesting because, the time that I was in the FBI was really a soul searching moment for that particular agency, in addition to the whole country. There was consideration of splitting up the FBI, taking out its intelligence function from its law enforcement function. Robert Mueller was a director then and kind of shepherded the agency through that. And a lot of things changed. What I think there's both, the two sides of the coin are this. Number one, we really, really, we were resilient, enhanced our intelligence capabilities. I think the FBI especially rose to the occasion. We were able to, fill all those gaps. And I think, the last 20 years, knock on wood, that we have not had a major foreign terrorist attack in the same way, attest to that. I think, and I have a piece coming out in Just Security tomorrow about this, I think in many ways the pendulum swing towards counterterrorism blinded us to some of the other threats on the horizon. The intelligence threat from Russia, the domestic terrorism threat. And I think in some ways we're kind of those chickens are coming home to roost. But I think, as I mentioned before, we can actually take a lot of what we learned in the war on terror abroad and be able to adapt them to kind of this new context. The irony, Amanda, is that many of these powers that were given to the intelligence community in the wake of 9/11 is precisely what many of these Republican members of Congress, who may have even voted for them, now object to. When they're used in a situation that could lead back to them, but that's where I've been thinking. And again, I have a piece coming out tomorrow with those reflections in Just Security.
Well, great. I will look for that article, push it out. Thank you so much for joining us. This was really great, Asha, and I hope to see you around in person, CNN sometime soon. And listeners, order those stupid over-the-counter COVID tests now because it's going to take you 2 weeks to get them.
And toilet paper.
Everybody. Yes. Bye.
Bye.